What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. In this video, I want to give you a complete rundown of how to fish offshore brush piles. So let's get into it. So first up, what is a brush pile? Well, a brush pile is basically just a tree, a pile of logs, or any type of wood that's been dropped offshore away from the bank that you can't see with your eyes. And brush piles can be offshore in as shallow as 3 feet of water or as deep as 50 feet of water. And the way that I identify brush piles is using my electronics. And so I want to run through what brush piles look like on your 2D sonar, down imaging, and side imaging so you know how to find them, and then we can talk about how to fish them. So first off, let's talk about traditional 2D sonar. And I actually don't use this type of sonar when I'm trying to graph offshore brush piles because it lacks the definition and the clarity of your down imaging and your side imaging. This makes it hard to determine if you're looking at a brush pile, a group of trees, a big rock on the bottom, or anything else that might be down there. And so I usually avoid this type of sonar when I'm looking for brush piles. That doesn't mean I don't use 2D sonar though, and there are a lot of applications for it. And I've talked about this in a lot of my other electronics videos that I have on the screen here, and that I will link in the description below. And if you do want to learn more about your bass fishing electronics, then check out my playlist on my channel, all about electronics, and the videos in the description, and it'll definitely help you out. Next up is side imaging, and side imaging is the most efficient tool you can use to identify offshore brush piles. And the reason for that is because side imaging is going to scan to the right and left of your boat anywhere from, let's say, 50 to 100 feet, and it'll allow you to see these big brush piles. And when I'm graphing offshore with my side imaging unit, one thing I always want to make sure I do is not set the range too wide when I'm trying to graph for brush piles. A lot of guys might try to set the range on their side imaging to, let's say, 150 or 200 feet, so they can try to scan as much bottom as possible to identify these brush piles. The problem with that is that the wider your range is, the smaller these brush piles will look on your screen. And so if you have your range set to 200 feet, the brush pile might look like the size of a dime or a nickel on your screen, as opposed to when you set your range to 75 feet, where that brush pile looked like the size of a silver dollar. And so I always make sure that I'm graphing with my range no more than 80 feet when I'm trying to graph for brush piles to make sure that I can catch even the smaller brush piles as well as the really big ones. And then the other thing you want to make sure you have set properly on your graph is your sensitivity. And I actually made a video explaining how to set up the settings on your fish finder regardless of the brand so you can actually clearly see what's down on the bottom using your electronics. So check out that video. Again, it's linked up here on the top of the screen and down in the description. And so once you have your range set properly and your sensitivity, you'll be able to clearly see the brush pile as if you're looking at it above ground. You'll be able to see the clear details of the branches, you'll be able to see the base of the tree. You can a lot of times tell what type of tree it is even if your sensitivity is set properly. And so that's the great thing about using your side imaging to locate brush piles, is that you have that image clarity and that target separation that will allow you to really pick out what you're looking at on the screen and tell that this is a tree versus a rock or something else. And that's something you don't get with your traditional 2D sonar. And then the last type of sonar that I will use to identify brush piles is my down imaging. And I actually use my down imaging mainly to identify fish in brush piles, not so much to locate brush. And what I'll usually do is graph over an offshore area, find a brush pile with my side imaging, mark it with a waypoint, then come back around and re-graph over that brush pile with my down imaging to see if there are any fish in that brush pile. And the way that you can identify bass in brush piles is by looking for small dots that are to the right or to the left or above the brush pile. And you'll know that these dots are bass as opposed to other species because these dots will only be stacked 2 to 4 dots tall, and they'll be spread out more horizontally than vertically. So if we take a look at a few of these images, you can see that the dots around this brush pile are only stacked 2 or 3 dots tall, and they're spread somewhat horizontally, though the brush pile can sometimes block the fish, and so you might not be able to see every single fish, but at least you can see 6 or 7 in this image. And if we look at another example, you can actually see very clearly that these fish are spread very horizontally over the top of this brush pile, and again, they're only stacked 2 to 3 dots tall. These are all bass. Now, another thing you might find in brush piles is crappie, and it's actually very common to find a lot of crappie in brush piles. And crappie, unlike bass, are going to stack up very much vertically and not very much horizontally. And what that means is that the dots may be stacked 7, 8, 9, 10 dots tall, even 15 dots tall, and they may only be 10 or 12 dots wide. So if you see dots around the brush pile and they're stacked more than 5 dots tall, 95% of the time that's going to be crappie and not bass. But if you see the dots are only stacked 2 to 4 dots tall, those will be bass, and you should fish those brush piles. So now that you've located the brush pile using side imaging and then graph back over the top of that brush pile to see if there are bass in it, you now need to fish it. And one common misconception about graphing offshore structure, and specifically brush piles, is that once you drive your boat over the top of that brush pile and scan it with your down imaging, those fish are going to get spooky and they won't bite. But that's actually completely incorrect. And every single time I fish a brush pile, I will always graph over it before I fish it, because I want to make sure that there are bass in that brush pile. If I don't see bass on my down imaging in that brush pile, I'm not going to cast on it. And I always graph over them before I fish them, and I still catch fish regardless of driving my boat over the top of that brush, so I know it doesn't affect them. And this applies for brush piles that are as shallow as 5 feet of water and as deep as 50 feet of water. And I actually graph over a lot of brush piles on accident that are in 5 or 6 feet of water, and I know the prop of my engine is no more than 2 or 3 feet from the top of that brush pile, but I'll still spin back around, fire a jig or a worm at that brush pile, and about 50% of the time I'll still get a bite. And so a lot of times it doesn't bother the fish that you're driving over these brush piles as much as you think it does, as long as you're maintaining a constant speed. The thing that's going to mess up these fish when you're graphing over any type of offshore structure is if you're changing the speed of your boat or like revving your engine. As long as your engine is staying at the same RPM level and going at a consistent rate and a consistent direction, it's not going to affect these bass really at all, because they're very used to boats driving over them all day long. So getting back on track here, let's say you just graphed over a brush pile with your down imaging and identified that there are bass there. Well, your next question will be, well, how do I make sure I get my bait down in that brush pile? And I've actually made a video explaining how to hit offshore structure using both a marker buoy and the waypoints on your electronics so that you can make your cast in that brush pile every single time first cast. So check out that video if you haven't seen it before. It's one of the best videos on my channel, and it will explain how you can actually hit all these pieces of offshore structure. And that's pretty much it. You just need to locate the brush pile with your side imaging, graph back over the top of it with your down imaging to see if there are bass there, and then cast on it with a lure to see if those bass are actively feeding. And that's a really important point there. The bass may not always be actively feeding when you cast your bait in that brush pile. And more often than not, when you put your bait down there, those fish may not eat your fishing lure, even if you know that they're sitting there in that brush pile. And from my experience, I find that I usually get bit on 1 out of every 5 brush piles that I fish, where I've identified bass in the brush pile. And the reason for that is because brush pile fishing relies a lot on timing. What I mean by timing is the time of day and the weather conditions, as well as the lake conditions. And all these factors are going to affect whether these fish are biting, and it will dictate your strategy of how you should be fishing these brush piles, how often you should be fishing them, and how you should rotate them. So let me get into that. First, let's address bass feeding windows as it relates to brush pile fishing. And in my experience, what I find is that bass are not feeding in a brush pile all day long for the majority of the year. Usually, there's going to be 3 or 4 small feeding windows throughout the day where these bass will be eating. And some of those feeding windows will be at night, and some of those feeding windows will be during the day. And so you may find that the only time that the bass are actively feeding in a brush pile where you've identified bass is, let's say, 8 o'clock in the morning and then 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And they might feed for 30 minutes during this period, and then the rest of the time they're going to be very inactive, and it's going to be hard to get those fish to bite. And so what will happen is that when these bass are actively feeding, you can throw any bait in there, and those bass will just fire up, and you'll catch 2 or 3 or 4 fish out of that brush pile, and you'll feel like you're on top of the world. You know exactly what you're doing. But if you pull up on that brush pile, let's say at 11 o'clock between those feeding windows, you might throw every single bait in the boat in that brush pile and still not get a bite, or you might get 1 bite every 30 or 45 minutes out of that brush pile. But that's not a really efficient way to go about catching fish out of brush piles. And the better way is to try to line up your time that you're fishing these brush piles with those feeding windows as best as you can, because if you can fish those brush piles during that feeding window, you're liable to catch 2, 3, or 4 bass in a row, and that's a lot more efficient than fishing one brush pile for 45 minutes or an hour and maybe getting one small fish to bite. And you may be wondering what creates these feeding windows, and I find that it's usually weather related or current related. And in terms of the weather, one thing I found is that the wind will usually help an offshore brush pile bite. And there are a lot of days in the summer when I'll be fishing offshore brush piles all day from 6 in the morning until noon, when it is calm and no wind. And then as soon as that wind starts blowing 10 to 12 miles an hour at noon, I start catching fish on every single one of my brush piles. And that wind stirs up the plankton around the brush tops, gets the shad more active, and those bass will start feeding on the shad, and all the fisheries become more aggressive. And so that feeding window on those brush piles is from like noon to 2 o'clock. Other times, the current can actually cause these fish to get a little more aggressive around these brush piles. And if you have a lot of current that's flowing through your fishery, let's say first thing in the morning, that brush pile bite can be better from 6 to 8 in the morning when that current's flowing, as opposed to the rest of the day when there's no current. And sometimes it's a time of day thing where the fish bite better in the brush piles first thing in the morning, regardless of the current or the wind. And sometimes they bite better in the afternoon. And it's not that easy to predict these feeding windows, and the only way you're really going to know what the feeding windows are on a particular fishery is to get out there, spend some time on the water, and really figure it out. And so I've actually developed a strategy for brush pile fishing that kind of eliminates the need to even know when those feeding windows are and how the weather and the current affect those feeding windows. So let me get into that now. So the approach I use to fish brush piles in any season of the year, from the winter, spring, summer, to the fall, is to try to fish as many brush piles as I can in a day and try to rotate the same brush piles 2 to 3 times throughout the same day to try to hit those feeding windows. To explain in more detail, let's say that I found 10 brush piles on Lake Ouachita, and I've identified that there are bass in each of these brush piles using my down imaging in my practice day before a tournament or a fun fishing day. And I've labeled all these brush piles 1 through 10, and I've also put their feeding window down. And this is the window at which these bass are going to be actively feeding on these brush piles. And so ideally, you would want to fish each of these brush piles at the time listed below each brush pile's number to catch as many fish as possible. Now, obviously, you're not going to know what the exact feeding window is for each of these brush piles when you get to the lake. And so we have to use probability to try to give ourselves a good chance of being at each brush pile during that specific feeding window. And so to do that, what I'm going to do is try to fish as many brush piles as I can and try to rotate each brush pile 2 to 3 times a day. And to do this, I'm going to pull up on brush pile number 1, fish it for 10 minutes, and make no more than 7 or 8 casts on that brush pile with 2 different baits. If I don't get bit, I'm going to move to the next brush pile. And I'm going to spend 10 minutes on that brush pile, make 6 or 7 casts, move to the next brush pile. And I'm going to continue doing this the entire day. So I'll fish brush pile 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And let's say I don't get any bites on those brush piles. Well, I'm not going to let that bother me. I'm just going to start my rotation over again. I'm going to fish brush pile 1, 2, 3, 4 again. And I'm going to rotate all 10 of these brush piles 2, 3, or 4 times a day. And as long as I've identified that there are bass in these brush piles, I feel confident that at some point my timing will sync up with one of the feeding windows and I'm going to catch fish. So for example, if we started fishing at 7 a.m. on brush pile number 1, well, if I fish that first brush pile for 10 minutes, then I'm not going to catch any fish because I'm not in the feeding window. If I go to brush pile number 2, again, I'll be fishing at like 7:10 and I'll miss the feeding window there. Brush pile number 3, I'm going to miss the feeding window there. It'll be 7:30. Brush pile number 4, I'm going to miss it again. But brush pile number 5, I'm going to hit that feeding window exactly. I'm going to pull up on that brush pile at 8 a.m., right when those fish are feeding, and most likely, if you hit that feeding window correctly, you're going to catch 2, 3, or 4 fish off that brush pile. And then you may finish the rest of your rotation and start a new rotation and not get any more bites. And you might not get bit again until, let's say, you get back to brush pile number 7 on your second rotation, and that window's at 10 a.m., and then you'll pull up there and you'll catch 2 or 3 more fish. And the idea with brush pile fishing is that you're just trying to run as many of these brush piles as you can, improving your odds of hitting one of those feeding windows. And as long as you get bit on 2 or 3 times that you stop and fish a brush pile, you can catch a good limit of fish, as long as you're getting 2 to 3 fish per brush pile when you stop. And so that means that if you fish 10 brush piles 3 times, you rotate those brush piles 3 times, you're giving yourself 30 opportunities to catch a fish. And as long as you catch fish on 3 of the 30 times you stop your boat and make a cast, you're going to end up with anywhere from 6 to 9 keeper bass in the boat and do pretty well on your fishing day. And then if you do better than that, let's say you catch fish on 5 of the 30 times you stop, then maybe you're going to catch 15 fish. And so this is the strategy I use when fishing offshore brush piles. I'm basically just rotating the same 10 or 15 brush piles I know have fish multiple times until I get bit. And it can be kind of a frustrating way to fish if you're not used to it, because you may go 2 full rotations sometimes without getting a single bite. But usually, if you're identifying bass in your electronics, you know they're there, and you rotate enough of these brush piles, you will hit one of those feeding windows and you will put a lot of good fish in the boat. And this is how I've won a lot of tournaments over the years. And a lot of times it comes down to me catching fish out of 1 or 2 brush piles in the last 20 minutes of a fishing day. And I hit that feeding window just right at the very end of my rotation, the last 30 minutes of the tournament, and I win. And so very, very common, but it definitely is an approach that works if you can trust it and do it all day long. Now, there are a couple of things in this approach that I really want to emphasize. And the first is that I'm only spending 10 minutes on each brush pile when I pull up and fish it. This means that I'm not going to sit on a brush pile and make 30, 40, 50 casts in that brush pile and sit there for 2 hours and trying to hit that feeding window by just staying on one brush top all day long. Usually this is not a very efficient or effective way to fish brush piles. And one way I relate it to guys who spend the majority of their time fishing down the bank is I'll ask them, how long do you spend fishing a laydown on the shore? Let's say that there's a nice juicy laydown laying on the side of the bank. Most guys will come to that laydown, they'll maybe make 2 or 3 casts with a spinnerbait, 1 or 2 casts flip in, and then they might fish like a Senko in it or a wacky worm if they're super thorough. But I never see guys pulling up on one laydown and fishing it for 2 hours straight. And that's the exact same thing that you're basically doing if you pull up and fish a brush pile offshore for 2 or 3 hours straight. Because really, if you think about it, a laydown on the side of a bank, especially a bigger laydown, is the exact same thing as a brush pile that's out in the middle of the lake. And there are going to be small feeding windows on these big laydowns down the shoreline as well, but no one ever sits on one laydown and makes 1,000 casts on it, unless you're fishing maybe like a tidal fishery, or you really know there's fish in that one laydown for some reason. But usually guys are going to try to fish as many laydowns as possible throughout the day and try to pick off 1 or 2 fish per laydown over the course of a day. And that's the exact same thing you're doing here offshore. Basically, offshore brush pile fishing is just like fishing laydowns down the bank. The idea is try to fish as many of these brush piles as possible, just like when you're fishing down the bank, you're fishing as many laydowns or as many docks or as many riprap banks or whatever as possible to try to put fish in the boat. And so one key to this approach is to spend no more than 10 minutes fishing these brush piles at a time. Now, obviously, if you fish this brush pile for 10 minutes on your first rotation, 10 minutes in your second rotation, and 10 minutes in your third rotation, that means you're spending 30 minutes fishing this one brush pile throughout the course of the day. And so it's not like you're fishing the brush pile for a short amount of time, you're just spreading out the time that you're fishing it over the course of a full day and giving it 30 minutes over an 8-hour period rather than 30 minutes straight at one point in the day. And another thing I want to clarify is that when I'm fishing these brush piles for 10 minutes, I always want to try to fish 2 different baits on these brush piles. So what I'll do is throw a crankbait, let's say, for 2 or 3 casts over the top of the brush pile, then throw a 10-inch worm for 2 or 3 casts on that brush pile, then move on to the next one. And then maybe in the next brush pile, I might switch up the baits I'm throwing. So I might throw a big hollow body swim bait on an underspin, and then I might throw a football jig. Then next time, I might throw a spinnerbait over the top of the brush pile and throw a drop shot in there. And so I'm going to constantly be switching up the baits I'm throwing as well to see if there's a certain bait that will trigger these fish to bite on a specific lake. But usually my go-to baits on brush pile fishing is a deep diving crankbait, a football jig, and a 10-inch worm. Those 3 baits get it done pretty much 95% of the time when I'm brush pile fishing, and they'll put a lot of big fish in the boat. And one more question you may have is how deep you should be looking for these brush piles. Should you look for brush piles in your home lake in 5 foot of water, 10 foot of water, 30 foot of water, 50 foot of water? How deep should you be looking? And I've actually made a video about this on my channel, and I'll link the video down in the description. It'll also pop up here on the screen. And it's a video about how deep to fish offshore. And the guidelines in that video will apply to brush pile fishing, so check that out if you want more information. And so that's pretty much it for this video, guys. I covered a ton of information here, and there's still so much more I could talk about, and I'm going to get into that in other videos, so please leave a comment down below if there's something that you still are unclear about or you want me to touch on further in future videos, and I can definitely do that. And if you did enjoy the video, really appreciate if you left a like on the video, as well as left a comment letting me know what you thought of the video and what was most helpful. And so thanks again for checking out this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.